"You're done here." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I stood across from Julian in what had been his father's office, watching his lips twist into that smug, familiar smirk. It was the one that had always betrayed his true feelings throughout our 12 years of marriage. In less than 24 hours since his father's sudden death, the man I had built a life with was systematically erasing me from the company we both worked for. But he had no idea what I knew. He couldn't possibly fathom what was about to happen, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand how I wound up in that sterile, redecorated office, you have to go back to the beginning, to where it all fell apart and then somehow came together. My father, David Vance, collapsed in the break room of Croft Sterling Holdings on a crisp October morning in Manhattan. A massive, unforeseen aneurysm. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived. At 25, I was working as a junior financial analyst at a rival firm on Wall Street, and in the span of a single phone call, I was utterly alone in the world. At the funeral, Arthur Croft approached me, his weathered face etched with a grief that felt as real as my own. He and my father had been inseparable for 30 years, starting out together as ambitious clerks in a mailroom and climbing the corporate ladders of different companies. "Amelia," Arthur said, his large, warm hand resting gently on my shoulder, "your father was the only brother I ever had. Before he passed, I gave him my word I'd make sure you were looked after." I was touched, but I waved away his concern. "I appreciate that, Mr. Croft, but I'm managing just fine on my own." Arthur's eyes, a piercing blue, held a look I couldn't decipher. "Please, call me Arthur, and I must insist, we'll have dinner next week. There's something I need to discuss with you." That dinner was the pivot point of my entire existence. It was there that Arthur introduced me to his son, Julian. He was tall and conventionally handsome, blessed with his father's striking eyes, but cursed with a complete absence of his warmth. Julian was polite, but you could feel the distance from him like a cold draft at the table. He was clearly there under protest. I would learn later that Arthur had orchestrated the entire evening with the precision of a military campaign, believing that a union between our two families was the most complete way to honor the promise he'd made to my father. 3 months after that dinner, I found myself engaged to Julian Croft. The proposal, if you could even call it that, was devoid of any romance. It happened over a dessert that cost more than my weekly groceries at a restaurant I'd never heard of, with Arthur beaming like a proud father while Julian slid a diamond ring across the polished table with all the passion of someone passing the salt shaker. "It makes sense," Julian had stated, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "Father believes we are a good professional match." I accepted. I accepted because, despite the frigid, transactional nature of it all, I recognized an opportunity. Julian was the heir apparent to Croft Sterling Holdings, a financial empire, and Arthur had already hinted that a place for me within the company was a foregone conclusion. It was far from love, but it was a strategic alliance, and I was young and ambitious enough to believe I could make it work. The wedding was a lavish spectacle, meticulously designed to impress New York's financial elite rather than to celebrate any kind of genuine union. I wore a Vera Wang gown that cost more than my first car, a dress that Isabel, Julian's mother, had chosen without even consulting me. She had looked me up and down in the boutique, her smile as thin as a razor blade. "We'll need to make you look like you belong," she'd murmured, the smile never once reaching her cold, assessing eyes. Our first dinner as a married couple, held in the cavernous dining room of the Croft Mansion on the Upper East Side, laid bare the battlefield I had just stepped onto. The room itself was oppressively formal, with oil paintings of stern-faced Croft ancestors staring down from the walls, judging my every move. "Amelia," Isabel said, her gaze fixed on the way I held my fork, "Julian tells me your father worked in finance. A small firm, was it not?" Vance Analytics wasn't large, I replied, keeping my voice steady. But my father built it from the ground up. Arthur quickly intervened. David had an incredible mind for risk assessment. That's where Amelia gets her analytical genius from. Isabel's smile tightened a fraction of an inch. How fortunate, though I've always held that some things simply cannot be learned. They must be inherited. Julian, as usual, remained a silent observer, swirling the wine in his glass, his expression a perfect blank. Later that night, he slept on the far edge of the king-sized bed, as far away from me as the mattress would allow. The first year of our marriage fell into a predictable, chilling pattern. Julian would be the picture of a charming, devoted husband at corporate functions, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, only to withdraw completely the moment we were behind closed doors. There were weeks he'd make a token effort, bringing home flowers or asking a perfunctory question about my day. Then there were weeks he'd barely acknowledge my presence in our shared home. 6 months into this charade, Arthur summoned me to his office. "I'd like you to join the firm," he said, sliding a thick folder across his vast mahogany desk. "We need someone with your unique skill set in our risk assessment department." The offer was more than generous, and I accepted on the spot, starved for a sense of purpose beyond being Mrs. Julian Croft. Julian was incandescent with rage when he found out. "Father didn't even bother to discuss this with me," he seethed later that night, his voice low and dangerous. "You're my wife, Amelia, not a Croft Sterling employee." "I have an MBA from Wharton," I reminded him calmly. "I am more than qualified for this position." "That's not the point," he snapped back. "The point is knowing your place." Despite Julian's bitter objections, I threw myself into my new role and excelled. Arthur became a true mentor, frequently stopping by my office to debate market trends or offer his guidance on my presentations. He saw a spark in me, a potential that his own son either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Isabel, meanwhile, found 1,000 subtle ways to express her disapproval. At company parties, she would introduce me only as Julian's wife, deliberately omitting my name and my professional title. She would launch into long-winded stories about families who had been in finance for generations, a pointed exclusion of my own background. "You'll learn our ways eventually," she told me at the company Christmas party, her voice dripping with condescension. "Some people just take longer to acquire a certain polish." Arthur witnessed that particular exchange and later apologized for his wife's behavior. "Isabel comes from old money," he explained, a weary look in his eyes. "She sometimes forgets that the most valuable assets often come from the most unexpected places." As my first anniversary with Julian loomed, the truth of my situation had become starkly clear. I had married into a dynasty that had no intention of ever truly accepting me. Julian tolerated me, Isabel undermined me, and only Arthur seemed to believe I had any real worth. And so I persisted. Each morning, I arrived at the office before the sun was up, determined to prove my value. Each evening, I returned to a hollow marriage that existed solely for the sake of appearances. And slowly, I began to realize that Arthur's promise to my father had created something neither of them could have ever anticipated. A business arrangement disguised as a marriage, but one that was giving me an inside track to a world I might one day be able to reshape from within. What I didn't know then was how completely that world would one day belong to me, or the steep price I would have to pay to claim it. My path at Croft Sterling Holdings wasn't exactly paved with gold. It was lined with whispers. I could feel the weight of eyes tracking me as I walked to my desk each morning, the silent calculations of whether I was a genuine asset or just a product of high-level nepotism. The risk assessment department was a sea of navy suits, an almost exclusively male domain where my contributions were met with raised eyebrows. "Mrs. Croft, that's an interesting perspective. Mark Peterson, the department head, would say after my presentations, a slight, deliberate pause before the word interesting that conveyed volumes of condescension. But I wonder if you've considered the more traditional approach. Traditional. That word became my shadow, a constant grating reminder that I was an outsider, an anomaly. So I started arriving at 6:30 a.m., a full hour before anyone else, poring over reports and preparing detailed counter-arguments for the inevitable pushback I knew I would face. I often stayed until the cleaning crews arrived, meticulously building financial models and risk analyses that were so thorough they simply couldn't be dismissed with a patronizing smile. My breakthrough finally came about 3 months in. I unearthed a dangerous level of exposure in one of our mid-sized investment portfolios that everyone else had completely missed. The client, a regional manufacturing firm, had been quietly acquiring smaller companies with massive, undeclared environmental liabilities. If any of these waste disposal issues trigger EPA action, they could face tens of millions in cleanup costs and fines, I explained to Peterson, sliding my detailed 50-page analysis across his desk. He skimmed the executive summary, his expression slowly morphing from a familiar skepticism to a grudging, undeniable respect. "I'll bring this to the risk committee," was all he said. When my assessment ended up saving the firm from a potential $15 million loss, the tone of the whispers began to change. I was no longer just Julian's wife to my colleagues. I was Amelia, the analyst who saw the risks hiding in plain sight. My life at home was evolving in parallel with my professional growth. 14 months into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. To my surprise, Julian's reaction was genuinely positive, as if a child was a tangible, expected asset, a box to be checked on his life's business plan. For the first time, he seemed to look at me with something resembling genuine interest, not just obligation. Our daughter, Ava, arrived during a blizzard that brought the city to a standstill. 7 pounds of fierce, tiny determination. She had his piercing blue eyes and my dark hair. Julian held her with an unexpected tenderness, a flicker of something soft in his expression as he counted her fingers. "She's perfect," he whispered. And in that fleeting moment, I saw a glimpse of the man he might have been, had he not been raised on a strict diet of ambition and appearances. Our home life settled into a fragile imitation of normalcy. Julian started coming home from work earlier, asking about Ava's small milestones, even initiating conversations over dinner. When I returned to work after 4 months of maternity leave, Arthur personally arranged a flexible schedule for me. "Family and career are not mutually exclusive, Amelia," he'd said, waving away my profuse thanks. "The company benefits from your perspective. The least we can do is accommodate your needs as a mother." 2 years later, our son Leo joined the family. He was a quieter presence than his sister, observant and thoughtful even as an infant. With 2 children under the age of 3, Julian and I reached an unspoken truce. We became functional partners, masters of the complex logistics required to raise a family while maintaining 2 demanding careers. We found our common ground in our children, even as every other aspect of our marriage remained a carefully managed performance. At the office, I had climbed the ladder from analyst to senior risk manager. I had my own small team and a direct reporting line to Arthur himself. Our twice-weekly strategy meetings became a fixture in both our schedules, intense sessions where we would dissect market trends and institutional vulnerabilities, speaking a shared analytical language that had developed over years of mutual respect. "Amelia sees patterns that others miss," Arthur commented during one quarterly leadership meeting, causing Julian's jaw to tighten visibly from his seat across the polished conference table. That evening, Julian's mood was glacial. He picked at his dinner, the silence heavy between us. "You and my father seem very aligned these days," he said finally, the words dipped in acid. "We work well together," I replied carefully. "He values a thorough analysis." "And I don't?" Julian challenged, his eyes narrowing into slits. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, he retorted, pushing his chair back from the table and leaving his meal half-eaten. Julian's jealousy began to manifest in small, insidious acts of sabotage. He'd raise questions about my department's budget in meetings I wasn't in, make suggestions that my reports were overly cautious, or create sudden scheduling conflicts that conveniently prevented me from attending key client presentations. I learned to counter his moves by documenting everything, building strong alliances with other department heads, and ensuring that my work was absolutely unassailable. Family gatherings became another front in our Cold War, with Isabel serving as Julian's unwitting second-in-command. At Leo's christening reception, she cornered me in the kitchen while I was preparing his bottle. 2 children already, she remarked, eyeing me over the rim of her champagne flute. I suppose motherhood gives you something to fall back on, for when the demands of work become too challenging. Actually, I replied, maintaining direct eye contact, I find that motherhood has sharpened my focus. Nothing clarifies your priorities like being responsible for someone else's future. My calm, measured response seemed to frustrate her far more than any display of anger would have. Over time, I perfected a strategy for handling Isabel's barbs, acknowledge them with polite grace, then subtly pivot the conversation. It was a technique that disarmed her without creating a scene, allowing me to maintain my dignity while refusing to be diminished. The real turning point in my career arrived during a market event that later became known within the company as Black Thursday. A major trading platform crashed during peak hours, locking our traders out of positions worth billions as the market went into a freefall. The risk management team was summoned to the crisis room, a chaotic pit of panic and shouting. I immediately noticed that no one was actually coordinating the response. Different departments were working at cross purposes, amplifying the chaos. While others were screaming and pointing fingers, I grabbed a whiteboard marker and began mapping out a structured response plan, categorizing our exposures, prioritizing the most volatile positions, and assigning specific, actionable tasks. "Everyone stop!" I called out, my voice cutting through the noise with an authority that surprised even me. "We need structure or we'll bleed out." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at me. Arthur, who had been observing the chaos from the doorway, stepped forward and said 2 simple words. "Listen to Amelia." For the next 6 hours, I directed the emergency response, making split-second decisions that averted catastrophic losses. By the time the market closed, we had contained the damage to a manageable level. Later that evening, Arthur found me in my office, still reconciling the final numbers. "You have a gift for crisis management, Amelia," he said quietly, his voice filled with a profound respect. "You keep a clear head when everyone else is losing their perspective." "I just saw what needed to be done," I replied, too exhausted to be anything but honest. "That's exactly the point," Arthur said, his gaze intense, "and that's exactly what this company is going to need in the future." I didn't fully grasp what he meant then, or that he was already laying the groundwork for a future where leadership would pass not to his own son, but to the woman who had entered his family as part of a deal and had since proven herself indispensable. Arthur's open recognition of my abilities marked a subtle but significant shift in the company's internal power dynamics. However, the fragile peace I'd brokered at home was about to be shattered again. 3 years after Leo's birth, I found myself pregnant once more. It was completely unexpected, a consequence of a rare, brief period when Julian and I had reconnected following a successful joint presentation we'd given to the board. The news of a 3rd child was met with a starkly different reaction than the first 2. Julian stared at the positive pregnancy test in my hand with an expression bordering on alarm. "Another one?" Amelia, we agreed 2 was practical. "Life doesn't always adhere to the business plan, Julian," I replied, my hand already moving to protectively cradle my still flat stomach. The pregnancy with our daughter, Maya, was difficult from the very beginning. Severe morning sickness kept me confined to our home for weeks, forcing me to manage my team remotely while battling waves of constant nausea. Julian's visits to my bedside became increasingly perfunctory. Quick, sterile check-ins before he headed out for client dinners that seemed to multiply in frequency as my pregnancy progressed. Maya arrived 6 weeks early, a tiny but fierce little thing. While Ava and Leo had Julian's blue eyes, Maya had my hazel ones, a direct, unsettling gaze that seemed to see right through people, even as a newborn. She fought her way through 2 harrowing weeks in the NICU, with me sleeping in a hard plastic chair beside her incubator, while Julian maintained his usual demanding work schedule. "She's a fighter," one of the nurses commented one night, watching Maya's tiny hand grip my finger with surprising strength, just like her mama. The day I finally brought Maya home, something inside me crystallized. A cool, clear understanding that had been forming for years finally hardened into certainty. My marriage to Julian wasn't a partnership. It wasn't even a functional relationship. It was a business arrangement, a merger of convenience that had produced 3 beautiful children but was devoid of any genuine connection. I watched Julian hold our newborn daughter, his expression distant, as if he were already calculating how soon he could reasonably hand her off and return to his evening engagements. In that moment, I felt a strange and sudden sense of freedom in finally, fully acknowledging the truth. I no longer expected love from him, which meant I no longer had to pretend to offer it in return. "I'm returning to work next month," I informed him over breakfast a few weeks later, with Maya sleeping peacefully against my shoulder. Julian lowered his newspaper, a frown creasing his brow. "That seems rushed." "I've arranged for excellent childcare for all 3 children," I replied evenly. "There's an executive director position opening in risk management, and Arthur suggested I apply for it." The newspaper crinkled in his hand as his grip tightened. "An executive director position? That's C-suite adjacent." "Yes, it is. You're barely 36, and I'm more than qualified," I stated, my voice leaving no room for argument. The tension between us solidified into something harder, more defined. Julian said nothing more, but the very next day I found out through a colleague that he had scheduled a closed-door lunch with the board's most conservative member, Walter Jennings, a man who still referred to senior female employees as the gals, regardless of their title. 2 could play at that game. I arranged my own quiet meetings with key board members, not to lobby, but to present detailed, forward-thinking proposals for expanding our risk assessment protocols into emerging global markets. By the time the promotion decision came before the board, I had built such a strong case and secured so much support that even Julian's backroom politicking couldn't block my appointment. The day I moved into my new executive office, with its coveted corner view of the city, Arthur stopped by with a small, wrapped package. "This was your father's," he said, as I unwrapped an elegant vintage fountain pen. "David would have been so proud to see you here today." I blinked back a sudden rush of tears. "Thank you, Arthur, for believing in me when so many others didn't." "Your value to this company has nothing to do with your last name, Amelia," he replied simply. "Never forget that." As my professional star ascended, Julian grew more and more distant. He started traveling more frequently. Quick, last-minute trips to Boston, Chicago, LA, always with a plausible business justification, but frustratingly vague on the specific details. The first piece of concrete evidence of his deception arrived innocuously. It was a receipt that fell out of his suit jacket as the housekeeper was preparing it for the dry cleaners, a significant jewelry purchase from a high-end boutique that had never made its way to my jewelry box. When I questioned him, Julian dismissed it coolly as a corporate gift for his executive assistant's 10-year work anniversary. It was plausible enough that I chose not to press the issue, but the seed of doubt had been firmly planted. More breadcrumbs followed. A restaurant charge from a trendy midtown spot on an evening he'd claimed to be working late at the office. A text notification that flashed on his phone from someone named Sophia, with a message that was far too intimate for a professional contact. These small inconsistencies began to accumulate like snowflakes in a blizzard, not enough to confront him with directly, but more than sufficient to create a cold, hard certainty in the pit of my stomach. Meanwhile, Arthur's once robust presence began to show signs of strain. The man who had always bounded up flights of stairs rather than wait for an elevator now moved with a slow, careful deliberation. Board meetings that he once dominated for hours now saw him calling for frequent, short breaks. One afternoon, when I brought some files to his office, I caught him dry swallowing a handful of pills that he quickly swept into a desk drawer the moment he saw me. "Just vitamins," he claimed with a dismissive wave, but the lie hung in the air between us, acknowledged but unchallenged. 3 weeks later, Arthur asked me to stay behind after a leadership meeting. He waited until every other person had filed out before closing the heavy oak door. "Amelia, I need to tell you something. In the strictest confidence," he began, settling heavily into his large leather chair. "I've been diagnosed with a serious heart condition. It's nothing immediate, but it's concerning enough that I need to start thinking about the company's future leadership more urgently than I had planned." My throat tightened. "Arthur, what can I do?" "For now," he said, his eyes locking with mine, "just be ready. I have watched you grow into an exceptional executive, someone who understands both the numbers and the people who generate them. Julian, he has many qualities, but he lacks your judgment. He lacks your ability to see the entire chessboard." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Before I could even begin to formulate a response, his assistant buzzed through on the intercom to remind him of another appointment, and the moment was lost. Over the next few months, these private conversations became our new routine. We had deep discussions about long-term strategy. He introduced me to his most trusted external advisors, and we conducted detailed reviews of parts of the business that fell far outside my direct responsibilities. Though it was never stated explicitly, it became overwhelmingly clear that Arthur was grooming me for something far more significant than my current role. The final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place on a rainy Tuesday in April. I was working late and needed Arthur's signature on some time-sensitive documents, but his office was dark and empty. His executive assistant mentioned he'd gone to check on a property investment, a company-owned residence used for visiting executives. "The penthouse on West End Avenue?" I asked, recalling the luxury apartment that was sometimes mentioned in corporate housing reports. "That's the one," she confirmed. "He keeps a spare key in his desk if it's truly urgent." The building was the epitome of discreet wealth. A silent doorman, a private elevator, the kind of hushed, opulent elegance that whispers of old money. Using Arthur's key, I let myself in, planning to just leave the documents on the counter with a note. But then I heard the sound of a shower running from somewhere deeper in the apartment. Thinking Arthur had returned without me hearing him, I called out his name as I moved toward the sound. What I found instead stopped me dead in my tracks. On a nightstand in the master bedroom was a collection of framed photographs, photos of Julian with a woman I had never seen before. In one image, they stood on a tropical beach, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. In another, they gazed at each other across a candle-lit dinner table, a picture of romantic bliss. The shower shut off. Frozen in a state of pure shock, I barely registered the sound of the bathroom door opening until a female voice called out, "Julian, is that you? You're early." I slipped out of the apartment before she could discover me. The documents I was carrying completely forgotten, my entire world tilting violently on its axis. The carefully constructed facade of my life had just been utterly demolished, revealing a betrayal more comprehensive and calculated than I could have ever imagined. My husband wasn't just having a few sordid indiscretions. He was maintaining a complete, parallel relationship in a luxury home paid for by his own father's company. What I couldn't possibly understand was Arthur's role in all of this. Did he know? Was he facilitating it? Or was this discovery precisely why he had been preparing me for something more? I spent the night after discovering the penthouse in a complete daze, mechanically going through the motions of preparing dinner for the children and reading them bedtime stories while my mind replayed every detail of my discovery on a torturous loop. When Julian called to say he'd be working late, again, the lie settled between us through the phone line, thick and toxic. I almost confronted him right then and there, but I held back. I needed time. I needed to process what I had seen and formulate a strategic response, not an emotional one. The next morning, I faced a dilemma. Confront Arthur about his potential knowledge of the arrangement, or wait for the right moment to play the card I now held. The decision was made for me when I arrived at the office to find the executive floor in a state of controlled chaos. Arthur had requested an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m., and department heads were scrambling to prepare their updates. The boardroom filled quickly, the tension in the room so thick you could taste it in the air. Arthur arrived last, his complexion ashen, but his demeanor as composed as ever. Julian sat to his right, scrolling through his phone with an air of practiced nonchalance. "Thank you all for accommodating this last-minute meeting," Arthur began, his voice steady but lacking its usual resonance. "I've received some concerning reports about our exposure in the Asian markets that require immediate—" His words cut off abruptly. The Mont Blanc pen he was holding clattered onto the polished mahogany table. His right hand flew to his chest, his eyes widening in a look of pure surprise more than pain. "Dad?" Julian's voice cut through the sudden, absolute silence. Arthur tried to stand, but his breath came in ragged, labored gasps. I was moving before anyone else in the room had even processed what was happening, my phone already in hand, dialing 911 while I simultaneously checked his pulse with my free hand. "His heart rate is erratic," I told the 911 operator, my voice miraculously controlled despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We need an ambulance at Croft Sterling Holdings, 53rd floor." The next 17 minutes unfolded in a horrifying, surreal slow motion. The boardroom cleared out, leaving only Julian, myself, and Margaret from HR, who had emergency medical training. We carefully moved Arthur to the floor, loosened his tie, and monitored his increasingly irregular pulse. When his breathing stopped entirely, Margaret began chest compressions while I counted the rhythm aloud, my voice echoing unnaturally in the cavernous, silent room. The paramedics arrived with an air of efficient urgency, taking over CPR and connecting Arthur to portable monitors that displayed a terrifying pattern of chaotic spikes and long, agonizing flatlines. They worked with practiced, grim coordination, administering medications, applying defibrillator pads, and calling out a stream of medical terminology that transformed Arthur, the man I knew and respected, into a clinical emergency. Despite all their efforts, Arthur Croft was pronounced dead at 9:37 a.m. The official cause of death was listed as a massive cardiac arrest. The man who had become a father figure to me over the past decade was gone, and with him, whatever plans he had been formulating for the company's future, and for my role within it. The immediate aftermath was a blur of notifications, condolences, and logistical arrangements. Julian, to my genuine surprise, appeared truly devastated, his usual polished facade cracking to reveal a core of raw, unfiltered grief. For one brief, surreal moment standing beside Isabel as she received a stream of sympathizers in the company atrium, we were united by a shared loss, not divided by years of unspoken resentment. That unity lasted for precisely 18 hours. The morning after Arthur's death, Julian arrived at the office uncharacteristically early. By 7:30 a.m., he'd convened an emergency session with the board's executive committee. By 8:15 a.m., he had been named interim CEO, and by 9 a.m., security personnel were implementing new access protocols throughout the entire building. I discovered this last development when my elevator access to the executive floor was summarily denied, my badge flashing an angry red error message instead of the usual green confirmation. When I was redirected to security, I was informed that organizational changes had been implemented overnight. "I need to speak with Julian," I insisted, a cold dread already beginning to pool in my stomach. The security guard, a man I had greeted every single morning for years, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. "Mr. Croft left specific instructions. You're to be escorted to clear out your office. Your access has been restricted to the 38th floor, and only for today." The humiliation of being escorted through the executive suite like a common criminal burned through the fog of my shock and grief. My former colleagues averted their gazes as I was marched past their offices. A security guard was positioned at my office door, watching silently as I mechanically packed my personal items, photos of my children, the vintage fountain pen from Arthur, into a cardboard box. "Your company devices need to remain here," the guard informed me, gesturing to my laptop and tablet, "and I'll need your badge before you leave." Fury, sharp and clarifying, cut through the fog. I straightened my spine, channeled every ounce of dignity I could muster, and placed my badge on the desk with deliberate, measured care. "I would like to speak with my husband before I go," I said, the word husband tasting like ash in my mouth. 20 minutes later, I was standing in Arthur's former office. Now it was Julian's. He had already begun to make changes. Arthur's collection of vintage nautical maps was gone, replaced by Julian's soulless, modern art pieces. The comfortable leather chairs where I had sat for countless hours, learning from Arthur, had been replaced with sleek chrome and glass furniture that prioritized aesthetics over comfort. Behind the desk, my husband leaned back in his new chair, the morning light catching the gold of his expensive watch as he gestured dismissively toward a visitor's chair. I remained standing. "I assumed you'd want a moment to pay your respects," he said, his expression a practiced mask of professional regret. "But honestly, Amelia, it's better this way. It's cleaner." "Cleaner than what exactly?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Then pretending this arrangement needs to continue," he said, straightening a pen on his desk. "Father is gone. There's no longer any need for us to maintain appearances. So, firing me is about our marriage, not about my performance?" A flash of pure annoyance crossed his face. "Your position was created by my father. The board agrees that we need to restructure, effective immediately." The board met less than 24 hours after your father died to discuss restructuring? "Some decisions can't wait for sentiment, Amelia," he replied coldly. "The company needs decisive leadership. Now." "Like the decisive leadership that maintains a mistress in a company-owned penthouse?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Julian's composure finally slipped. For just a fraction of a second, genuine surprise flashed across his face before he masked it again. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I said. "Just like I think you've been waiting for this moment for years. A chance to take control and erase anyone who might challenge your authority, starting with your wife." His lips curled into that familiar, hateful smirk. "You're done here," he said with an air of finality. I leaned forward slightly, placing my hands flat on his new, sterile desk. "Perfect," I whispered. The word hung in the air between us, my calm acceptance clearly not the reaction he had been anticipating. Before he could respond, his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Croft, a Mr. Walter Phillips is here. He says it's regarding your father's will and it cannot wait." Julian frowned, pressing the intercom button. "Send him in." The door opened to reveal a man in his 70s, with a shock of silver hair and a worn leather briefcase. Walter Phillips had been Arthur's personal attorney for over 30 years, the man who handled matters too delicate or personal for the company's internal legal department. "Mrs. Croft," he nodded to me with formal, old-school courtesy, "I'm glad you're here as well. This saves me the trouble of having to locate you separately." Julian's expression darkened. "My wife was just leaving." "Actually," Walter said, setting his briefcase on the desk with deliberate care, "given the contents of your father's last will and testament, I believe Mrs. Croft should remain for this discussion. What I am about to share will be highly relevant to both of you." Walter Phillips settled into the chair across from Julian, adjusting his glasses before unlatching his briefcase. I remained standing, caught between my primal instinct to flee and a burning curiosity about what could possibly be relevant to me now. "Prior to his passing," Walter began, removing a sealed envelope and several thick bound documents, "Arthur made some significant changes to his will and to the corporate structure. He was very specific about the timing of this revelation." Julian leaned forward, impatience etched into every line of his face. "I'm aware my father updated his will last year. The board has already confirmed my position as CEO. On an interim basis only," Walter corrected mildly. "The board cannot make any permanent appointments regarding leadership or asset distribution until the full terms of your father's will are executed." He carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope. This should clarify matters considerably. What followed was the most extraordinary 15 minutes of my entire life. Walter's measured, calm voice laid out Arthur's final, masterful plan. He explained in detail how Arthur had spent the last 5 years restructuring the company's ownership, gradually transferring shares into a complex arrangement of trusts and holding companies. "The summary is this," Walter said, looking directly at me, not at Julian. "Arthur Croft has left 65% controlling interest in Croft Sterling Holdings to Mrs. Amelia Vance Croft. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air out of the room. Julian's face drained of all color, then flushed a deep, mottled crimson. "That's impossible," he finally sputtered, his voice a strangled gasp. "There has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake," Walter replied, sliding a bound document across the desk toward Julian. "Your father was nothing if not methodical. He left detailed, notarized explanations for every one of his decisions." My mind was racing, trying to process the words I was hearing. 65% controlling interest. The empire that Julian had assumed was his birthright was now impossibly mine. "Why?" I asked softly, finally finding my voice. Walter removed a handwritten letter from his files. "Arthur asked that I give this to you privately, but given the circumstances, perhaps it's best if it's read now." The letter, written in Arthur's distinctive slanting script, laid his entire reasoning bare. He had watched me grow from a pawn in an arranged marriage into a capable and formidable executive. He had seen Julian's chronic lack of judgment in both his business and his personal affairs. And most surprisingly, he had known about the penthouse arrangement for years, not because he condoned it, but because he recognized it as irrefutable evidence of his son's flawed character. "I promised your father I would take care of you," Arthur had written. "This is how I fulfill that promise, by entrusting you with the company I built, knowing that you will protect it not just for yourself, but for Ava, Leo, and Maya. Julian will receive a 20% ownership stake. It's enough to maintain his lifestyle, but not enough to control the company's direction. This isn't a punishment. It is protection for everyone involved, including him." Julian's fury finally erupted as I finished reading the letter aloud. "This is absurd. I am his son. I have worked at this company my entire career." "As has Amelia," Walter pointed out calmly. "Arthur made this decision with full mental capacity and with thorough legal consultation. These documents are ironclad." "I'll challenge it," Julian threatened, slamming his fist on the desk. "No judge in this city will uphold this betrayal." "You are welcome to try," Walter replied, completely unfazed. He then reached into his briefcase and withdrew another, thinner document. However, Arthur anticipated that reaction. "This file contains evidence regarding the penthouse apartment, the offshore accounts you have been maintaining, and several questionable client transactions you've made over the past 3 years." Julian went perfectly still, his blanched expression confirming every single implication. "Arthur did not include this information in the will," Walter continued softly. He had hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but he was always a man who prepared for all contingencies. I found my voice again, a new strength flowing through me. I think I need some time to process all of this. Of course, Walter nodded. However, there is the matter of the board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. As the majority shareholder, your presence will be required to ratify all leadership positions. The next 24 hours were a surreal blur. I returned home to find that Julian had already cleared out his essential belongings, leaving only a terse message that he was staying elsewhere. That evening, I held my children close, maintaining a bubble of normalcy for them while my entire internal landscape was shifting tectonically. By morning, I had made my first decision as the controlling owner of Croft Sterling Holdings. I would honor Arthur's faith in me. The board meeting was a masterclass in shifting power dynamics. Several members who had enthusiastically accepted Julian's ascension just days before were now scrambling to align themselves with me. Others remained skeptical, their expressions carefully neutral as Walter outlined the new ownership structure in painstaking detail. While this transition is unexpected, I addressed the room after the legal explanations were concluded, my voice clear and steady. It does not change our fundamental mission. Croft Sterling will continue to prioritize sound investment strategies and ethical business practices. And the leadership structure? Walter Jennings asked, eyeing me doubtfully. I will be assuming the role of CEO, I stated simply. My first priority will be to stabilize our client relationships during this transition. By the end of the day, my access card had been reactivated with the highest possible security clearance. My personal items were returned to a new office, Arthur's former space, which I insisted remain largely unchanged as a constant reminder of his vision. The security guard who had escorted me out like a criminal now nodded respectfully as I passed. The most difficult task, however, still remained. 3 days after Arthur's funeral, I used my newfound authority to access the penthouse apartment. This time, I didn't slip away. Instead, I waited in the living room until a woman emerged from the bedroom. She was tall, elegant, and probably in her mid-30s. Her initial shock at finding me there quickly morphed into a wary resignation. "You must be Amelia," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I've seen pictures of you with the children." "And you are?" I asked, my composure a carefully constructed fortress. "Sophia Davis." She gestured helplessly around the opulent apartment. I suppose this was inevitable. What I had expected to be a bitter confrontation evolved into something far more complex. Sophia, it turned out, had been fed a carefully constructed narrative by Julian. He told her our marriage was in name only, a sham maintained for the sake of the children and his father's approval, and that their relationship was the real one. He promised we'd be together officially after Arthur passed away, she explained, twisting her hands in her lap. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I truly thought everyone understood the arrangement. Clearly not everyone did, I replied dryly. Over the next hour, Sophia revealed details that completed the puzzle of Julian's deceit. She spoke of the promises he'd made, the financial arrangements, and even the discussions they'd had about how the children would eventually be integrated into their life together. It became painfully clear that she had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had, albeit in a different way. "What happens now?" she asked, finally. "I assume you'll want me gone." I considered her question carefully. "Actually," I said, an idea beginning to form. "I may have a proposition for you. The restructuring of Croft Sterling Holdings began the following week. With Sophia's insider knowledge of Julian's hidden dealings and my own deep understanding of the company's legitimate operations, we methodically began to untangle years of his questionable arrangements. Sophia's background in compliance at a rival firm, the real reason Julian had targeted her in the first place, proved invaluable as we implemented new, stringent oversight protocols. Julian's attempts to challenge the will faltered almost immediately when faced with the mountain of evidence Arthur had compiled. In the end, he negotiated for a generous settlement in exchange for his remaining 20% ownership stake, effectively and permanently removing himself from the company. On the 1-month anniversary of taking control, I invited my children into my office after hours. Ava, now 9, examined the space with curious, intelligent eyes. 7-year-old Leo quietly investigated the detailed model ships Arthur had collected, and 5-year-old Maya climbed directly into my lap at the massive desk. This was Grandpa Arthur's office, I explained to them. Now it's mine, and someday it might belong to one of you. Dad says we aren't going to live together anymore, Ava stated, her tone matter-of-fact. He says you took his company. I turned my chair to face the glittering Manhattan skyline, gathering my 3 children close. This company was built to last for generations, I told them, my voice soft but firm. Grandpa Arthur trusted me to protect it for your future. Your dad and I have different ideas about how to do that, so yes, we'll be living separately. But you will always have both of us, and you will always have a place here. As the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, I felt Arthur's presence in the room, not as a ghost, but as a legacy that was now entrusted to my hands. The empire he had built would continue, transformed by my vision but always honoring his foundation. And the woman he had brought into his family through an arrangement of convenience had found something he likely never anticipated, not just security or success, but a genuine, unshakable purpose. End of story.